first, the NFL draft process has been ongoing for some time, and the headliner of this NFL draft, a young man out of USC by the name of Caleb Williams, maybe you've heard of him, just had his pro day today. Now, I'm not going to talk about his pro day because, to be honest, I think pro days they are the most useless for quarterbacks than any other position. Because what do we know about quarterback? Well, first of all, like any position on the field, you're going to have pads. Well, you don't have that at pro day. You're in a t-shirt and shorts. In the case of Caleb Williams, throwing us some beautiful USC weather. More on weather in just a second. I'm not going to be a meteorologist, but more on the weather. Also, the fact that part of being a quarterback is reading defenses, processing defenses, being able to get in and out of your reads. You really don't learn that during pro day. You just simply don't. So, again, I don't put a whole lot of stock in pro day for Caleb. For a prospect I don't like, kind of in between on, I don't put a whole lot of stock in it. What I do put stock in, and anything regarding football, the game of football, is a man by the name of Deion Sanders, primetime head coach of the Colorado Buffaloes, who coached against Caleb Williams last year in a game that was very entertaining. Down the wire, Colorado made a last-second comeback, but USA was able to pull out the W at the end. But Deion Sanders was talking about Caleb Williams. He was on Pro Football Talk on Sirius XM on Mad Dog Radio, and he was talking about Caleb Williams. This is what he said. Quote, "Let me tell you something I have a problem with. And this kid can flat out play. I think he's the best one on the board this year for sure. A kid that's coming from California for the last couple of years, right? And went to Oklahoma. That's not terribly cold. Chicago's cold, man. You got to think about that kind of stuff when you're taking a young man. Like, see, when you take a guy from Ohio State and you bring him to Chicago, okay, I can understand that. But from California to Chicago, not only that, they added what? 1 or 2 games to the NFL, 17 games? End quote. So Deion Sanders is basically saying, hey, Caleb's used to playing in warm weather, Oklahoma, USC. And the Chicago Bears, who had the first pick, are basically guaranteed to take Caleb Williams. In many ways, I get that to a certain degree, except when you look at NFL history, both recent and in the last 3-4 decades or so, okay? Here's some quarterbacks who played in warm weather in college, who played in some cases, frigid temperatures, who had excellent careers. Patrick Mahomes, best quarterback in the league, one of the greatest we've ever seen, right? Texas Tech went to Kansas City. It's not exactly toasty in Kansas City. We saw the playoff game this year, one of the coldest of all time. Mahomes has done quite well for himself. I think that's the understatement of the year. Aaron Rodgers, who I'm going to be talking about pretty soon on Carving Up the Context. He went to Cal. Then he went to Green Bay. I've criticized Aaron for his playoff history and lack of leadership. I cannot question the results in terms of his production. 4 MVPs, a Super Bowl title, and undeniably one of the 10 greatest to ever play his position. Joe Burrow, LSU, not as warm of weather as Cal or USC, but let's be honest, Louisiana, down south, it's not exactly going to get to Michigan or Ohio State weather, which Burrow actually did transfer from Ohio State to LSU, went to Cincinnati. Again, not a very warm city. Been pretty good. Okay, the issue with Joe Burrow has been injuries. I don't think that's been caused because of some icy temperatures or icy conditions in the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. Jim Kelly famously went to UCLA, and Buffalo was one of the cities he did not want to play for because of the weather. Well, Jim Kelly went to Buffalo, and we can rip their Super Bowl history all we want. They did go to 4 Super Bowls in a row, and Jim Kelly is part of probably the greatest quarterback draft ever in 1983, right? John Elway, Dan Marino, and Jim Kelly, probably the greatest draft class of quarterbacks of all time. John Elway, Stanford, Bay Area. It gets a little chilly in the winter, but still not Michigan or Minnesota or something like that. Went to Denver. John Elway was pretty good. Won a couple Super Bowls, had one of the most successful careers in NFL history. The thing that all of these guys have in common, Kelly not as much as the rest, although Kelly is a Hall of Famer. Mahomes, Rodgers, Elway, and to a certain degree, certainly Joe Burrow. I mean, Joe Burrow has lived up to being the number 1 overall pick in 2020. There's no question about that. The thing that those guys have in common, generational talent. Now, I wouldn't put Burrow quite in the class in terms of just pure raw ability that I put Mahomes, Elway, and Rodgers, but Burrow, his greatest attribute, great in the pocket and insanely accurate. Probably the most accurate passer in the league. Mahomes is not far behind. Generational talent. Is that not what we've been discussing? At least what I've been discussing. Joel Klatt and many of the draft experts have been, I don't consider myself a draft expert, but draft experts have been talking about. Arm strength off the charts. Moves well, good in the pocket, good outside the pocket, can move, is mobile, right? Accurate, good decision maker. Basically everything you could possibly want in a prospect coming into the National Football League, really outside of being 6'4", which Caleb's not exactly small. He's 6'2". He's about Mahomes' size, Aaron Rodgers' size. He's got it. I feel like we're at, and I've talked about this before, I feel like we're at the point in the draft process where, especially when we have these drafts where it's consensus, everybody knows who's going number one. Everybody knows who's going number one. And frankly, we've known since last year. It was just who's going to have the first pick. And via Carolina, Chicago got the first pick. Caleb's going there. And so we see what we will see. I feel like because we have a month and a half toward the draft, because it's so inevitable who's number one, we're picking him apart. And for the record, one of the quarterbacks I mentioned, Joe Burrow, I was one of the people who did this to Joe Burrow back in 2020. Now, I didn't have a YouTube show at the time. There was very much younger days in the Carving It Up podcast history, but I was a Joe Burrow skeptic. I was here, no, he's going to be like to Cincinnati what LeBron wants to Cleveland. Now, that is still a bit of a stretch. LeBron literally changed the economy of Cleveland. I don't think Joe Burrow's doing that in Cincinnati, but I was a skeptic. I'm like, man, loaded roster around him. Great offense. Great offensive play calling staff. Joe Brady, we saw the success he had with Josh Allen last year. He had success with Burrow at LSU. Yeah, loaded roster again. Accurate, but maybe not making NFL throws. How's he going to adjust to the next level? A franchise that's not historically well run. Well, Joe Burrow's done pretty darn well for himself. And even the criticisms of Caleb Williams. The number one has been, well, the situation where he cried in his mother's arms. Right? The situation where after the loss, I believe it was to Washington. I could be wrong. I think it was to Washington. Went to the stands, cried in his mother's arms. And I mean, bawled in his mother's arms. I've always said this on this show for years. And again, maybe it's the soft side of me. Of course, who's to say it's even soft? Give me the athlete, male or female, that is so mad, so angry, so pissed off at losing. They are literally they are moved to the point of visible emotion. Give me that person over the kind of apathetic athlete, i.e. Ben Simmons, Jay Cutler. Ask yourself, Chicago Bears fans, if you're skeptical about taking Caleb Williams, think back to the Jay Cutler days. Whenever you guys lost a playoff game, which there wasn't many of those with Jay Cutler, but lost a playoff game or lost a big game to the Packers or something like that, and you saw Jay Cutler walking to the locker room through the tunnel, right? You see the fans there. He's walking through the tunnel at Soldier Field. Did you ever feel like Jay Cutler cared as much as you did? You really didn't. You feel like you were more bothered as a Bears fan than Jay Cutler, who's being paid quite handsomely by the team to be their starting quarterback and have success. Caleb is the exact opposite. And I feel like if him being quote-unquote too emotional is an issue, I feel like you can rein that back in to the point where your emotions can be, to a certain degree, like under control, especially if you're a quarterback, right? And again, Caleb's decision-making, he didn't throw a lot of interceptions at USC. Like, if Caleb was like a 15 to 20 pick guy or was just making bad decisions, then I'd be like, okay, maybe his emotions bleed into decision-making. We didn't see that at USC. So even the flaws, quote unquote, with Caleb Williams aren't really flaws. Brendan Rice, who's coming out of the draft this year, spoke highly of Caleb Williams. A lot of the guys have. Lincoln Riley loves Caleb Williams. So guys who come out in this draft, his coach, they like him. Keenan Allen, who now plays for the Bears, was traded there this past week, showed up at his pro day, catched up with Caleb Williams. So again, potential rapport there. It's not like he's got legal issues. Again, not to go after Baker Mayfield, because I think Baker's turnaround in terms of his maturity has been awesome. But Baker had a police tape. Baker had issues with, remember grabbing his junk against Kansas and just like moments that didn't exactly scream franchise quarterback. And whether it was the fall from grace from Cleveland, then to Carolina, then to the Rams briefly, and then he went to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, basically left for dead, leads him to the playoffs, gets a massive contract, well-deserved. Whatever it was, a combination of all those things, the maturity, and Baker's always been a chip on his shoulder guy, but he's been able to control it now after years of experience. Who's to say that's not going to be the case for Caleb Williams, who doesn't have legal issues, who hasn't had any real problems with the opposition in terms of, man, this guy, look at this guy. If Caleb had like a Johnny Manziel off the field stuff, he'd be like, oh, okay, like you gotta start asking some questions, because the fact of the matter is the quarterback is the representative of the organization. Whether it's the coach, the GM, the owner, the fan base, the quarterback is the representative of that. So you need them to kind of be put together, mature, good at the podium at press conferences, right? I wouldn't say Caleb Williams is an A+ like a Patrick Mahomes in that regard, but I wouldn't say he's a guy I'm going to be talking about later, Aaron Rodgers, in many ways. So again, I think even the concerns with Caleb are, yeah, you can coach that. You can coach it. You can reel it in. He goes to the right situation. And again, I don't love the head coach situation in Chicago, but I think they got a good OC in Shane Waldron. Assuming they were to move on from Eberflus someday, you're telling me that's an unattractive job in Chicago with Caleb Williams and this young talent they've got there. Great defense, great fan base. I think that'll work. So again, even the concerns for Caleb, are they as big as people are making them out to be? And as far as the pure raw ability in terms of what Deion Sanders is saying, that's not to say what Deion Sanders is saying, it doesn't have validity to it. But we have example after example after example of highly talented quarterbacks who went to warm or warm-ish weather schools, went to frigid temperatures, and were amazing. So if Caleb Williams is not successful in the NFL, I don't think it's going to be because of the frigid Chicago temperatures. Because one thing I think and then we'll move on. One thing I think all cold weather quarterbacks need to have, they got to have a strong arm. They got to have a strong arm. Because when you're throwing through some rough conditions and the ball feels like a brick, you better be able to throw the ball down the field efficiently and at a very high level. Mahomes, cold weather quarterback. Rodgers for years. Even Jay Cutler, who I was never a fan of. Jay Cutler had a massive arm. Josh Allen now in Buffalo. Joe Burrow doesn't have a big arm in Cincinnati. So again, that's a little bit, but it's crazy accurate. So he makes up for it with another insanely, talented gift. Caleb's got the big arm. So to me, in that regard, the cold weather question is not a question, at least as far as I see it. But Caleb Williams, remarkable talent. And again, I think we're in the space where we're just I wouldn't say overanalyzing, but nitpicking every little bit. That's not to say we shouldn't be, but to have that cloud, the clear positives of drafting number 1 overall, I think would be a mistake. One that the Bears are obviously not going to make. They just traded Justin Fields to my Steelers. But let's not overanalyze, because we tend to do that around draft time, especially with highly touted prospects. Thanks so much for watching the show on YouTube, and be sure to go click that big red subscribe button and check out the other clips and full shows from Carving It Up Live, as well as our other incredible content creators here on the Grid Network.